Hi everyone, welcome to the GADN Members Meeting. Thank you for joining us on this first very rainy day that made me not want to leave my bed, and now quite a hot day, I think. So my name is Yamina. I'm the Senior Counsel and Policy Officer at the Gender Development Network, and with me today I also have Sophie and Katie at the back. I just want to say a few words and hi.
Hi everyone, I'm Sophie Tange. I'm the Head of Policy at GADN. I feel like I know most of you. Hi, welcome.
Hi, I'm Katie Frank. I'm the Network Coordinator at GADN.
Thank you. So welcome. Thank you for coming to this members meeting on gender and climate. What should Northern governments do next? Before we get started, just a few housekeeping things. So we're going to take a few pictures throughout the meeting for our comms work. If you don't want your pictures taken, please just let us know. Then toilets, there are toilets on the ground, first and second floor, also accessible toilets on either end of the lifts. Emergency exits, there won't be any fire alarm tests, so in case there is an alarm, we have to take it seriously. So please just leave the meeting room via the nearest fire exit, which is signposted in the back. And then we'll just go down to the courtyard and assemble in All Saints Street. Then in the back, we have some coffees and teas and biscuits, and you'll also see a little water cooler. And in terms of recycling, there's a bin that's green, which is for the cups and napkins and the food, we were told. And the yellow is recycling, and all non-recyclables can go into the red one. So now that that's out of the way, for today's meeting, we're very grateful to be joined by three amazing speakers and experts on gender and climate. First, we have, I don't know if you can see them yet, no, not yet. We have Gina and Endevile who are joining us online. And then we also have Shanja here from Plan International, who is Policy and Advocacy Advisor at Plan International UK. And then we are also very grateful that Francesca Rhodes from CARE is here with us today, who will be moderating the panel as she also works on the intersection of gender and climate. And she'll also introduce the speakers in a little bit more detail later, so I don't have to do that now. So before we jump right in after the presentations, we will also have time for a short panel discussion and also a Q&A with all of you. The nice thing about being a small group is that you can all ask questions and it can be a little bit more interactive because we have time. And then in the second part of the meeting, as you will have seen, there will also be space for updates from us as the Secretariat and for all of you to share what you're currently working on and to network with each other, also on topics beyond climate. And we'll have the room until 5, and then we'll also go to the pub after, so please feel free to join us for that as well. We'll tell you where to go and how to do that. So yeah, I'll hand over to Frankie now for the more interesting bits. Thank you.
Thank you. Great to be here. So I'm just going to introduce the topic a little bit and then introduce our first speaker. So it is undeniable that we find ourselves in the midst of a global climate emergency, with the latest reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change providing unequivocal evidence of an impending climate breakdown. It is also well evident that gender equality and the climate crisis are intrinsically linked, with women and girls being disproportionately affected, particularly in marginalised communities. At the same time, women are often at the forefront of climate movement and shaping climate action. However, their voices remain largely unheard in government policy, hindering progress towards gender-transformative climate solutions. Instead, Northern governments' insufficient responses to the climate crisis further exacerbate the existing outcomes of gender inequality. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Endevile Morkena. Endevile works as a project coordinator for Gender CC Southern Africa, Women for Climate Justice, based in South Africa. The focus of her work is on climate and gender justice issues, including policy advocacy for gender integration and its intersecting issues, building capacity at the local community level, and raising awareness on climate change across the board. She was the Women and Gender Constituency's Global South focal point from 2018 to 2020, and the WGC is one of the 9 approved constituencies of the United Nations Framework on Climate Change Convention, so the UNFCCC, the UN framework that holds the COP meetings every year in the climate negotiations. So we will hear more about the work of the Women and Gender Constituency in Gina's presentation as well. Endevile is going to discuss the international policies, treaties, agreements, and frameworks that are relevant to gender and climate work, how to approach this from an intersectional and transformative approach, and what global north countries can do in this space. So over to you, Danilo.
Thank you so much. Are you able to share my presentation?
Yes.
Please, if you can share that for me.
1 second.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to be here. As I have already been introduced, I will just go straight to my presentation. As the first slide is looking at, I think go up a bit.
Yes, this is the first slide.
This is the last slide.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, is it upside down?
Can you see that?
Okay, yes. Can you move to the next slide?
Sure.
Thank you so much. Let's see. And the next slide. Go up a bit.
Can you see that? Go back to the last one. International policies, treaties and agreements?
Yes, and there's no slide before that one.
No, there isn't. This is just the opener.
Oh, okay. All right. I will just talk through to the intersectional of gender and climate change. I'm not sure how I missed this slide, but in any case, let me just talk through to that, where we're looking at the intersectional of gender and climate change in this space, and highlighted here the underlying systemic social inequalities. And according to UN Women, women and girls are disproportionately impacted by the effects of climate change, as you have already alluded to in your opening. And this is particularly true in least developed countries. Women and girls are as much as 14 times more likely to die as a result of disasters resulting from climate change than men and boys. Women are more often poor, have less access to finance and information, and more frequently have domestic responsibilities, limiting their mobility. Furthermore, women's unequal participation in decision-making processes and labor markets compounds inequalities and prevents women from fully contributing to climate-related planning, policies, and in implementation. And in many lower income countries, women do the greatest amount of subsistence farming to provide for their families, and they are more often involved in the protection of natural resources. This experience and knowledge is crucial to developing adaptation and mitigation initiatives which are suited to local conditions. Now, intersectional gender transformative change, which is what we need to move forward. Gender and other social inequalities are fundamental drivers of poverty all over the world, and this has to change. Gender transformative change is fundamental to creating a world that works better for everyone. Everyone benefits when women and men enjoy equal opportunities to work, to participate in decision-making, to lead, and to thrive. As feminists, we believe that everyone should have the opportunity, resources, and support to achieve their potential. Gender equality is part of development. That is why we advocate for the advancement of gender equality and women's empowerment across all climate actions work streams, particularly looking at farming that works, because nearly half of the world farmers are women. Women play a vital role in ensuring food security and nutrition in most communities. Yet women face persistent inequalities and in access to and control of productive resources such as land, input services, finance, market information, and technologies. Evidence shows that removing gender-related barriers in agriculture and business could substantively promote growth, accelerate poverty reduction, and catalyze food security. And then also looking at energy that transforms. Almost 3 billion people can't cook cleanly, and 1 billion don't have access to electricity. Indoor air pollution is one of the leading causes of mortality amongst women globally. Women spend many hours collecting fuel and have to carry heavy loads for long distances, often at considerable risk to their safety. As key energy users, women's experiences are essential for inclusive energy policies. And also looking at resilience that protects. Inequalities across age, disability, socioeconomic status, and gender exacerbate disaster risk. As mentioned earlier on, that women often have less access to assets and limited decision-making power. So barriers to information can mean that women struggle to access warning information or lack awareness of how best to respond. In many contexts, women are left behind to help children and the elderly to safety, but are all too often overlooked in rescue volunteer groups and training. Despite all the barriers they face, time and again, women demonstrate they have the ideas, courage, and energy to take action and lead during disaster preparedness and response. It is therefore vital to acknowledge women as agents of change for climate justice rather than as passive victims. Ultimately, it is only by empowering people of all genders to act that we can hope to achieve a sustainable solution the climate crisis. Looking at the slide now, I'm sorry, I must have sent you the wrong presentation. Looking at the slide now that is talking to international policies, treaties, and agreements. In the global context, there are a number of key international agreements that characterize the response to both climate change and gender inequality, though a few are integrated. The establishment of the Sustainable Development Goals, which followed the Millennium Development Goals, and the Paris Agreement in 2015, both set new benchmarks for an integrated approach to gender-responsive development and climate change. Although international laws and frameworks increasingly recognize the interlinkages between climate change, human rights, and gender equality, most countries have been slow to integrate these concerns into their national policies and commitments. When a country ratifies international law conventions and subscribes to international agreements, the government acquires legal obligations that need to be translated into domestic actions. But we see very few of those actions. Among these actions is the implementation of public policies that adhere to the norms and principles expressed in those conventions and agreements. We need international and regional frameworks and processes that address the links between human rights, gender equality, and climate change. Looking at the root causes of human rights violations and vulnerability to climate change, there are 3 cross-cutting factors across all sectors and countries. Firstly, is the existing gender inequalities caused by power imbalances in both private and public spheres, discriminatory laws and practices, and unequal access to and control of resources. The feminist recommendations aimed at policymakers and other stakeholders describe an intersectional human rights-based and gender-transformative approach to climate action aligned with existing commitments in international and regional processes and policies. Speeches and agreement are not enough to ensure gender justice. Words must be followed by actions. The framing should formulate holistic policies to address climate change, human rights, and gender inequality together. Align national policies with international and regional commitments regarding climate change, human rights, and gender equality. Recognize rights related to the environment in national legislation and advocate for the recognition in international human rights laws. These include the right to healthy environment, to a safe climate, to non-toxic and healthy ecosystems, to clean air and water, and to healthy and sustainable produced food, and are preconditions to fulfilling all substantive human rights. These should prioritize actions and redress social and gender inequalities through transformative programs. Gender inclusion cannot be just a tick box exercise. It needs to turn into robust action that fosters women's agency and gender equality. There should be climate-related development finance as well. Unfortunately, there is no specific requirement in the UN climate commitments reporting system to track gender responsiveness in climate finance. Every project should have gender analysis in it, including gender sensitive outcomes and indicators in their project activities. The next slide, please. Now, looking at what global North countries can do, the first issue there is finance and support. The Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan, decision of the COP27, includes provision encouraging parties to increase full, meaningful, and equal participation of women and to ensure gender responsive implementation and means of implementation, including by fully implementing the Lima Work Program and the Gender Action Plan. It also invites parties to provide support to developing countries for undertaking gender-related action and implementing the CAP. It also adopted the guidance to the Green Climate Fund, invited the Fund's board to consider enhanced ambition in its next gender policy and to consider the implementation of the Lima Work Program and its Gender Action Plan within existing guidance. The GCF board was also encouraged to consider enhancing the provision of support through the Readiness and Preparatory Support Program for the development of national and subnational gender strategies as they relate to climate change, and consider further strengthening the gender programming of GCF activities through supporting the implementation of policies and projects therein. So these recommendations need to be adhered to by all nations. Recommendations to climate finance donors. Donors should agree to mandatory reporting of the gender objectives of their development climate finance to the UN in order to track progress against gender action plan. They should ensure that gender integration is consistent in their climate commitments across recipient countries. Gender equality as a cross-cutting issue should be integrated into funds to middle-income countries, just as it is in least developed countries. Donors should also make greater efforts to ensure mitigation projects are gender responsive, building on best practices identified. Donors and civil society should seek to influence and share best practices with the private sector and multinational development banks to improve gender responsiveness in their climate finance activities. Now, looking at enhanced and increased ambition, climate justice requires that polluters who have caused the most damage take the lead in reducing emissions. This should be done without false solutions, colonial appropriation of the South resources, and corporate control over technologies and knowledge. Instead, democratic decision-making and participatory socio-economic planning at the local level should be central in governing resource use and management. We need a truly systemic and rights-based response to the current crisis. By gathering information and data on implementation of the Paris Agreement, this will help to evaluate progress on the world's efforts to slash greenhouse gas emissions enough to limit global temperature rise well below 2 degrees Celsius. Building resilience, climate impacts, and align financial support with the scale and scope needed to tackle the climate crisis. Looking at reform of international finance, this should include vulnerability-sensitive sovereign debt management, food systems transformation, and food-related financial innovation and mobilization. Now, working towards gender equitable participation in international negotiations and decision-making. Research has also shown that the international climate change process will be unable to achieve truly global legitimacy or relevance until it adopts the principles of gender equality at all stages of the process, from scientific research through analysis, gender formation, negotiations, and decision-making, regime implementation, and finally in further development and evaluation. Gender-sensitive priorities and processes need to be mainstreamed at all levels of negotiations and decision-making around climate change and mitigation. It is in the remit of all governments who are part of the international negotiations on climate change to ensure that gender concerns are reflected in policies and related programming. All policies and programs also need to be coherent with existing commitments, such as the Convention to the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the CEDAW, the 1995 UN Beijing Platform for Action, states that a gender perspective needs to be mainstreamed throughout all UN activities and negotiations. The next slide. This is my last slide. In conclusion, I just wanted to say double mainstreaming of gender and climate is the only way forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Davile. It was great to hear about the different impacts of climate change on women and girls, some of the international treaties which exist, but how they need to really be implemented, and governments need to be held to account for how they're really integrating gender into their climate work, and then also the real need for a rights-based response to the climate crisis. And so I'd now like to turn to Gina Cortez Valderrama, who is a Colombian activist and advocate working towards climate and gender justice, with a focus on the intersections between feminism, decoloniality, and degrowth. She's currently part of Women Engaged for a Common Future as Gender and Climate Policy Manager, co-focal point of the UNFCCC Women and Gender Constituency, a member of the collective of Colombian migrants in Germany, Aluna Minga. Gina is going to discuss the colonial foundations of the climate crisis and the need for a systemic transformation of the capitalist system from a gender perspective. She will also talk about the work of the Women and Gender Constituency and how they work collectively to advocate and provide alternatives on different levels. So over to Gina.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Davile, for your great introduction. And also it's an honor to be following you in different stances. So many thanks for the inputs that you have provided. And I think that building up on some of the recommendations that you have done as well, on the context that we are talking, I think it's also important for us to contextualize and to make a linkages on those root of the multiple crises in which we are through a feminist lenses, a decolonial lens that can understand as why some of the different narrative solutions, technologies that are putting now into on the table are just a perpetuation of such structures. I don't know if you also have my slides, so we could have a start on that. Amazing. Maybe you can put it into full screen, and I think that that would be easier just for you to switch from slides, maybe in the big arrow. Things. Yeah, great, super, thank you. So if you go to the next slide, to start contextualizing the discussion, or to start contextualizing these root causes of the climate crisis and the multiple inequalities that we are currently facing, we need to start from the understanding of that current notion of development, a current notion of development that has been imported to the majority of the world through an imperialist imperative, and that has shaped the means and modes of productions and has been laid on the foundations of the historical and also ongoing exploitation of the territories, as well as the outsourcing of labor based on gender and geographic divisions. And this current notion of development has been following a current goal that is that infinite desire of growth, that we can see it currently in our policy making spaces, such as, for example, increasing just some points into the GDP, the gross domestic product, without making a reflection on what is needed, on the sufficiency, on the use of those resources. And decades of excessive natural resource extraction to supply materials and energy, particularly to the minority of the world, also understood by the global north, has caused permanent and irreversible losses and damages in countries that, even though they have historically contributed the least to the greenhouse gas emissions, these countries, these regions, these populations are the ones that experience disproportionately the negative impacts within their economies, their social structures, their livelihoods, their cultural heritage. And the same countries that were plundered in the past during that violent colonization processes, and which today suffer the greatest impacts, are those that continue to subsidize rich nations, corporations, multilateral development banks to maintain the status quo. And in this process of losses and damages that you might have heard the term, we're not only talking about infrastructure or economic or monetary perceived values or commons, let's say, or goods, rather also talking about those threats to traditional ways of life, to different non-monetary values, such as, for example, languages, traditions, among many others. And this growth imperative relies on those patterns of colonialism that has paved the way to appropriation as well as to exploitation. And yeah, for example, also I was reading in an article recently from a fierce feminist and colleague from us on how the minority of the world, the global north, composed of just 16% of the population, is responsible for the 74% of the overshoot of material resource use in the world. Yeah, so this is also for us to give us some ideas on how the relationships in terms of extraction are, and also how these pathways of development had catalyzed intersecting forms of oppression, discrimination, and thereby hindering achieving a life in dignity for all. Next slide. And that was too fast. And the climate crisis is a global human rights threat and a pivotal global public policy issue for us. I think
Oh, sorry, yeah, I think that's your next one.
I think that one, yes, super, thanks. So the colonial, the patriarchal, the capitalist hierarchies have perpetuated this indiscriminate use of natural resources. As I was saying in the beginning, from the majority of the world, and have outsourced intensive, undervalued, low wage or unpaid labor according to an individual's sex or geographical location. Yeah, and under that monopoly of capitalism, rural, Black, Indigenous, and women of color have been mainly exploited and deprived of many different rights, and have been subsidizing these structures in which we are this colonial system in which we are living currently. No, this imperial acquisition of the global North countries at expense of the other countries for the sake of a development or a narrative on safety, liberty, and so on, and also and others. So based on these, as well as many of the elements that have been mentioned as well by Divile, that have been already clarified in the way that climate change is not gender neutral, no? The persistence of gender-based discrimination, inequality, stereotypes, patriarchal institutions, no? On how those colonial elements are still within these institutions and have been inherited, continue to hinder women's access to control and use of resources and information to address climate change effects in a timely manner. Next slide. And there was a mention at the beginning of the session, and I would also like to bring it now, and it's regarding the last IPCC report. One of the IPCC reports that have been mentioning many different elements, many elements such as recognizing, even though communities on the grounds have been talking about these elements for already decades, on how colonial structures have perpetuated inequality, but is now, let's say, taken by the IPCC, and as well how the last report of the IPCC has left no excuse for governments to keep on delaying actions towards what is needed, towards a phase out of fossil fuels, a phase out of that extractive system. And it calls out as well the historical and ongoing patterns of inequity, such as colonialism, what we were saying. So in this discussion, and what also is bringing us today in this dialogue, in this conversation, when we talk about what the minority of the world, that global North needs to start doing, we need to be talking about those colonial structures that perpetuate extractive systems. And it doesn't matter if we get into uncomfortable spaces. It doesn't matter if it's not understood. That, you know, it's a conversation that needs to happen and on which governments need to be taking action, particularly those governments as well that have been pledging those feminist foreign development climate policies, particularly linked to this and what the IPCC and also other reports have been saying. It is reported on how public and private finance flows, and I am quoting, for fossil fuels are still greater than those for climate adaptation and mitigation. At the same time, a report that is titled Banking on Climate Finance, that is a fossil fuel finance report that was launched last year, in 2022. Fossil fuel financing from the world's 16th largest bank has reached $4.6 trillion US, with 742 billion in fossil fuel financing in 2021. So digesting a little bit these numbers, and I forgot to put into this slide, but there are also some numbers on how the profits from the 5 biggest extractive industries have been profiting last year and last year's, while the world was kind of about colliding during a COVID pandemic crisis, that show us clearly how the climate crisis bill is out there. And that we know who needs to pay, who must pay, and we must make sure that the polluters pay. Next slide, please. So this is one part of a main issue that we're talking when we're talking about those extractive systems, colonial systems. And now we have also another element that comes into the discussions, particularly getting or creeping its way into the international policy making negotiations and other discussions, and it's around dangerous distractions. Dangerous distractions understood as some technologies that have been popular and that are being marketed as positive offsetting mechanisms for achieving that net zero mantra, and that in reality are unproven technopics with risky technologies that are also putting a threat to undermine human rights, to displace communities, and to threaten as well ecosystem and biodiversity relationships. And some of these dangerous distractions you might have heard about it, such as, for example, geoengineering, bioenergy and carbon capture and storage, solar radiation management, ocean fertilization, among many other technologies that, by going a little bit deeper, and because within the session we don't have that much time to dive a little bit deeper, but I could send some links on, if you dive into which is the narrative behind that, which are the institutions and the individuals pushing for that, you would also start understanding those elitist power that keep on pushing to maintain the status quo. These technologies act as a smoke screen, allowing for continued emissions and profit generations from fossil fuel structures. And when deployed, or if deployed at the large scale, these dangerous distractions will have detrimental social, equity, and environmental consequences. And at the same time, they are distracting the narrative, the discourse, the funding towards those solutions, those real solutions that are needed and that are already showing evidence on the benefits that they have for the communities, for local driven solutions. So these approaches that we are discussing neither challenge present power structures nor old ways of thinking. And as you're reading in the slides, this is this greening of technological capitalism and colonialism can hide deep inequity and injustice elements, and once again affecting people and communities that have done little in this climate crisis. When you start understanding and analyzing where those solutions are going to happen, in whose territories, who is pretending to do it. So how this is respond to the same colonial imperative. Next slide. As well, and going into how we know we need to start moving, framing our collective fight as movements, particularly as feminists, and I'm going to start connecting that with our feminist calls and demands. The IPCC as well in the last report has been very clear, saying that there is a rapidly closing window of opportunities to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. As well, it states that the choices and actions implemented in this decade will have impacts now and for thousands of years. And something that I found very interesting in the report as well was that they say how ambitious mitigation pathways imply large and sometimes disruptive changes in existing economic structures with significant distributional consequences within and between countries. I think this is something very, very interesting to start analyzing. This is with high confidence. So it is important for us to start now making the connections with as well what has been built up and what has been part of the resistance actions from different movements across the world that are actually have been calling for that redistribution of power within the same countries, but also thinking about those extraterritorial relationships. Next slide. So this is part of the way that we as the Women and Gender constituency, but also with other networks of movements have been framing that collective fight and is on to shift development pathways fueled by colonialism that promote destructive and extractive use of energy and material under a capital thirst for infinite growth. Next slide. And with this, what is the call for action, in the sense that the discussions around climate action should center on this comprehensive and long overdue transformation of the system that we have been describing before, because another world is possible, and it is possible with actions that prioritize equity, social, gender, climate justice, as Ndivil was saying, through rights-based approaches. Feminism in its different and multiple colors, languages, expressions, imaginaries, acts, strategize, advocates, resist towards dismantling those structures that are very tight embedded in our current system, and that are perpetuating those cycles of violence, cycles of murder, because we are talking here about murders. This extractive system is murdering people, either by health issues, due to the polluting nature of these activities, by land grabbing, by forced displacement, also up to the spectrum of direct murdering those who are protecting the land, those that have stand or stood strongly to protect our right to live in this planet. Next slide. So through an intersectional approach that understands those differentiated impacts, which is fundamental from a feminist analysis. When we talk about an ecofeminist approach and analysis, we are talking about exactly that intersectional framework that understands those inequalities, how it exacerbates each other, how when we are talking, for example, about the reflection and the recognition of multiple layers of oppression on the basis of gender, race, ethnicity, language, age, socioeconomic power, academic level, geographic location, nationality, among different others, how that provides as well a better understanding of the structural, historical, and institutional root causes for the different layers of discriminations. Next slide, because I think my time might be that. So, so concrete alternatives to this dominant development model already exist on the ground. For the majority of the world or the global south. The colonial imaginaries that challenge that preconceived beliefs and practices of a predominantly Eurocentric thinking have been already materializing for decades ago. Those concrete alternatives already exist, and they are based context-based. They play in contrast, as the slide is saying, in contrast to that individual response, that is still part of the same narrative, such as, for example, pushing a just transition and then focusing on how we are going to keep on driving on electric cars and individual solutions, while not making a reflection on the public, the commons goods, and on those pluralistic initiatives. And also how, next slide, you can go to the next slide, how we can ensure, a safe, clean, and healthy environment. So to close a little bit and to discuss about the women and gender constituency, that I think is also part of the interest or for the conversation today. The women and gender constituency is one of the 9 different groups representing the civil society within the UNFCCC, that stands for the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change. Is kind of the body, like the intergovernmental body institution that talks about climate change within the UN, which is as well a party-driven process. Party-driven process meaning countries are the ones taking the decisions or voting by consensus, but they are 9 different groups representing civil society with the status of observers. Among these constituencies, you would find environmental NGOs, indigenous people, trade unions, youth and children, businesses, research, farmers, local governments. There is also a caucus that has not been officially recognized, but that we are really integrating in our work, and is the Disability Caucus, and we also have the Women and Gender constituency. Next slide. So the Women and Gender constituency, yes, we were saying we work in different manners and we have a set of different demands, what you can see here, but I would really invite you to go to our website so that you can also check into more into depth which are the concrete demands that have been framed for the different COPs, the different climate conferences, but also the different topics that we have been discussing, such as, for example, energy, water, oceans, dangerous distractions, ecosystem-based approaches, among different others. And we call for a just and a gender-responsive climate frameworks that respects and promote human rights and gender equality, that also goes in line with this call from climate justice that makes a call to historical responsibilities on the ecological debt from the minority of the world by a principle recognized by the UN framework that is on the common but differentiated responsibilities. Next slide. So the way that we work is connecting our network. Our network is consists of more than 700 organizations around the world, and we also have different members. And all together we frame our collective demands, our collective work, connecting those local struggle, experiences of resistance, local solutions into the international space, into the policy-based space, pushing for more support, funding, and the different frameworks to enable how to uplift, how to scale up those solutions. So we work in connection with the different constituencies and being the main channel of communication conduct with the COP presidencies, as well as with the UNFCCC, working in collective advocacy with some of the things that I have mentioned, capacity building and strengthening through trainings, thematical strategy meetings, as well as working in different groups so that we can we do not as well overburden ourselves, but how we can trust all the different expertise that we have from different regions in an intergenerational manner as well, with different languages, and how we can follow the lead of feminists from the different regions, such as, for example, what had happened in the last year, that we follow the lead of the African Feminist Task Force on the road to the African COP. And for these COPs, we are following the lead of the MENA Feminist Task Force. And something that I would like to end up with is the next slide on the gender just climate solutions. The gender just climate solutions, for those that don't know, and I am going to close very soon, apologies for taking more time, is one of the insignia programs from the Women and Gender constituency, which started in 2015. Yeah, in 2015, started in 2015 as a way to bring that evidence on exactly those models that are fighting those systems, those root causes that we have mentioned and contextualizing before, through different solutions that are community-based, locally owned, that are, for example, pushing or promoting solidarity economy models, agroecology, energy cooperatives, among different indigenous knowledge, among different other a wide spectrum of solutions that I invite you all, and I will share the links afterwards, to check the publications, because it's incredible, the work, and how this work then is also linked to the advocacy work, to the political demands with those concrete examples. Next slide. So the call for applications, because this is made as part of an awards ceremony, and there is a yearly application for folks to be part of the Gender Just Climate Solutions, is now open. It is going to close by the end of July. You can find more information in our website, and you can please promote it, send it to different partners that would like to be part of the program. It's not only about showcasing the evidence, but it also comes with a mentoring program on how then the different solutions organizations can be part now of integrating the being part of that policy making space with a more active voice, and with the accompaniment, because this is a very abstract and hostile scene, I would say, the UNFCCC. So kind of walking together on that, and it's a beautiful process. And I think I will just end with that. And next slide. Yeah, well, this is just for you if you want to learn a little bit more about what I have been talking about in terms of the context of colonialism, capitalism, throughout the climate crisis, what is failing, what has been, and what is needed. I would invite you to check our publication, Transformative Pathways. We are going to have the translation in Spanish and French soon. And the next slide, thank you so much for having me here today.
Thank you, Gina. It was really helpful to think about how the idea of growth and gender inequality and climate change all have their roots in colonialism, and that we need to avoid dangerous distractions and unproven technologies, and instead focus on changing the system and with a human rights intersectional approach. And also really good to hear about the work of the Women in Gender constituency, and I'm sure people can have a look at the website and see also how they might be able to get involved and join, I think, if they are involved in COP discussions. So next, I'd like to turn to Chanju, who is a policy and advocacy advisor at Plan International, and he's going to provide us with a little bit of UK context. So Chanju, I would like to ask you, what are the opportunities for influencing the UK government on the intersection of the climate crisis and gender equality? And what has the UK government committed to in that regard?
Yeah, thank you. It's really great to be here and actually, heard from Lily and Gina, some of the reflections that they've had. And I think some of the points that I'm going to pull out actually speak to what they said, so seeing how we can contextualize that in the UK. One second, sorry. I'm working on it. But while we just get those out, I've just got two very brief slides to illustrate and visualize so that you're not just looking at my face. So the UK government has recently made several new strategies and commitments that are centered on climate change, and I think it's important to recognise that in all of them they do have quite a few references around climate and gender. So what can you do with organisations to kind of push them on those to go a little bit further? So I've put here a few of them. So in March we had the 2030 Strategic Framework for International Climate and Nature Action, and that kind of outlines the UK's vision for meeting its climate and nature's goals across this decade. And then we've also got the International Climate Finance Strategy that together for People on Planet One, which is about how UK is going to spend its £11.6 billion commitment to climate finance between this year up until 2025-2026, and that was quite interesting to kind of see the different actions that they've committed to as part of that spending. And then we'll be aware of the Women and Girls strategy, which does have climate kind of integrated throughout in climate actions, and brings up commitments to bringing together climate action and gender equality as well. And then finally in December, the SCDA released a new paper which was around addressing the it's got a long title, addressing the climate, environment and biodiversity crises in and through regards to education. So that's bringing up that intersection of education and climate change and recognizing the need to look at education within climate spaces as well. wanted to reflect a little bit broadly on some of the wider FCDA priorities around gender and climate, which I think will be really interesting for this group. This is based on kind of conversations that we recently had with the FCDO. Firstly, around championing women's leadership and decision-making in climate action, both through working multilaterally and bilaterally. And I think that's something that's really important that's come through from the presentations that we've just seen, the importance of women's leadership, ad youth leadership, and girls' leadership into that as well, and that locally led action point as well. Then adaptation and building the resilience of women and girls in this context. Again, that historic lens that Gina just gave is a really good rationale and justice point on why the UK has a role in supporting these changes. And then again, just based on the piece that they've released in December, there is a big focus around education and climate change, building on that position paper and mainstreaming the kind of intersection of education and climate change across both FCDO and then departments in the UK government. Again, bringing out the how do we make sure that gender is mainstreamed within that. And then more broadly, there's linkages with SRHR and the impacts of climate change on services that particularly impact kind of women's and girls' rights as well. And yeah, this is basically an overview of some of the commitments that the government has made, the key strategies that have recently come out. And then I wanted to now reflect a little bit on what are the issues that we can kind of pull out, that we can focus on, and opportunities to influence the UK government. So if we can go to the next one, please. And I think this really speaks to both of the presentations that we've just heard, but actually ensuring that gender responsive climate finance that actually reaches local organizations and addresses power imbalances in distribution is at the forefront of the international climate finance strategy and the way that they actually go about the actions that are outlined within it. I think I'd say that it needs to include women's rights groups, indigenous groups, organizations, people with disabilities, and commitments to actually addressing the barriers to access for these groups. So how can the UK make sure that it's understanding what the barriers are and how they can get international finance to that group? I think that was an interesting statistic that the majority of funding that's for gender equality kind of goes to international organizations and northern donor-based organizations, with only 1% of gender-focused aid reaching southern-led feminist groups. And so that's the kind of broader picture. So what does that mean for climate finance specifically? And then also there'll be a smaller number within that 1% that goes to youth-led groups, girl-led groups, and so on. So actually, how can we make sure that we're advocating for the UK government to take this issue seriously and actually think about how they can reach those groups? What can we do to outline and highlight the barriers for these groups as well? Something that I noticed was that we've noticed is gaps on reaching children and young people specifically. There's quite a few commitments around reaching women, but yeah, I think there's something around advocating for child rights within that climate space. And then also just on the second point, I think, again, this speaks to points that both Gina and Indivle mentioned around actually ensuring that there's coordinated and holistic approaches to addressing climate change and gender equality together. And I think this comes out mainly through the women and girls strategies, opportunities of kind of seeing the intersection of climate and gender embedded across the UK government policies and programs as well. I think an example could be, for example, the hunger crisis. What are the impacts and how is the hunger crisis being approached from both gender and climate perspectives, as well as education and climate change. We know that there's terrible statistics that 12.5 million girls will be stopped from completing their education by 2025 as a result of the climate crisis. So how is the work that is being done by the UK government, seeing these as holistic issues, intersectional issues that can be addressed together rather than kind of working in silos and saying, this is a gender issue, this is a climate issue, that doesn't exist, these things don't discriminate. So how do we make sure that there is a holistic approach in the way that the government's doing their kind of actions around climate and gender? And then also, I think one of the things is the FCDO has been very clear on their shift to understanding the links between climate, nature, and poverty, but I'd say that we need to add that justice angle in there and the equality angle within the climate and nature agenda, which might not necessarily come out as much. And I think that, again, speaks to the points that we've heard already. And finally, I think some of the things that we can actually think about looking forward in terms of influencing opportunities to make sure that climate and gender are mainstreamed. I think that's what Ndizwe said, that we need to make sure they're mainstreamed across everything essentially, is looking up ahead to not only the current government, but actually in the context of the general election that's coming up, how are we making sure this is prioritized across parties? We know that, for example, Preet Gill in Labour is leading the development of the feminist development and foreign policy work. How are we making sure that climate and gender are mainstreamed across that, bringing in the points around the UK's historic responsibility in these spaces. And then also the SCDO is actively engaged in this space and interested in CSO perspectives around this. So how do we make sure that the voices of women and girls that are kind of at the forefront of this are reflected in these conversations, that we're sharing that power and able to kind of make sure that these issues are seen from this holistic approach. Those are kind of the main reflections that I had, very brief, and yeah, just a few things to think about in how we can take on the presentations and the things that we've had today into our work moving forward as well.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful. Understand what the UK government's doing, but where we can push them. So I'm now going to open up to the Q&A. So if anybody has any questions for any of the panelists, you can put your hand up. And yeah.
Hi, my name is Kayla. I'm a policy advisor at Aid International. Mine's a little bit of a logistical one. You seem to have worked quite well with the SEO. I was just wondering, do you have any particular contacts that are open to civil society engagement with them, or any particular entities that would be open to people engaging on this agenda and climate involvement?
Yeah, I think in SEO there seems to be one person who works on gender and climate, which is definitely a tricky one, and they kind of coordinate across the department as well. I think Desmond's for energy. I should know the energy net zero.
It's always changing.
I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah.
Old Bay, former Bays, and sure would have gender people. But I think there's a few organisations who are looking at gender and climate, and I think would definitely be having to kind of think about how we can come together and approach them together, so that yeah, we're able to engage on this issue as a whole. Lots of people going to the same person. There is one, but yeah, happy to share kind of details after as well.
Marie?
I'm Marie Bushman from GADN International. Thank you so much for the great presentations. I really like the idea about overhauling the economic system to make it more climate just and all of that. It is just such a complex issue. So I work on women's economic justice, and climate feels like really, like climate change is such a complex issue, and then you need to tag on or add the economic change to it. And I just wonder whether you could give us some thoughts on where to start and how to like move towards this bigger change, but what are the incremental starting points to get to this bigger change that we'd like to achieve?
Collect a couple more and then go to our speakers online. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Florence. I'm from GAP, Gender Action, Peace and Security. And a couple of the presentations mentioned feminist foreign policy, and I'd just be interested to hear a little more about the feminist perspective on feminist foreign policy, whether you think that this is an opportunity for engagement on issues like climate and gender, and whether there's the potential for feminist foreign policy to be truly transformative in a way that we haven't seen through other engagements in this topic, or if there's concern around potential cooptation of feminist foreign policy, and how do we, in engaging with those spaces with this decolonial lens, and do so in a way that, yeah, it doesn't lose the essence of that transformative and structural approach that we're working towards.
One more.
Okay, Rachel, Masika, independent. I have 3 questions, but I'll stick to the technology one. Gina, this is for you. You mentioned that there were technologies and some of them were risky. Are there some technologies that we see that could actually benefit the climate change situation? And should we be encouraging more women to go into technology and engineering so that they shape these technologies?
Thank you. So one question on where do we start on the bigger question, the bigger picture and transforming the system, one around feminist foreign policies, and then one on any potential technologies that could be useful. So maybe Gina, would you like to go first in answering the technology question, and then any of the others that you wanted to comment on?
Could you please repeat the whole question? I put in the chat if it was possible for us to write the questions, because for us it's not clear to listen to people on the audience. So I just get some words, so I cannot really.
So you were talking about technologies for climate change and how some of these distract from the discussion. My question to you is, are there some technologies that are useful for climate change? And should we be encouraging women and girls to go more into engineering and technology so that they can shape the technologies?
Absolutely, absolutely. I absolutely. So when I was talking about those dangerous distraction, it is by no means a message on no, we must not be looking into technology development, implementation, or deployment in the different regions, and that's not the way to move forward. No, not at all. It's the message was rather on those particular technologies that are being now put into this narrative or this framework as plan B. No, there is a narrative that is going on outside, so we are going to reach out. No, the overshoot is closed, the tipping points are going to be reached. Now we need a plan B, no, in the sense of we are not going to make it in this and this and this and this way, and now we need to come with these massive technologies taking out of science fiction, to be honest, such as, for example, ocean fertilization, like or solar radiation management. Solar radiation management is a technology that has been put, and I'm not imagining this is something that has been put in the table, and is to put some jets, some aircrafts like going in circles through the earth, putting some little particles of sulfur among other dioxide things in the atmosphere, so that these particles can reflect the sun, the sunlight, I don't know the word in English now, but this type of and how they need to be constantly driving, flying through the air so that it doesn't stop, because when they stop, that's something that is called termination shock. I think the word says everything, and how there is a lot of elites, or a lot of mainly, and sorry about that, but mainly all white men from the power, from the elites, pushing for putting those technologies. So the message is, let's focus on those solutions that are working, those technologies that are working, those technologies that are being thinking, about how we can respond to a community need and priority. And in the publication that I have shared in the chat, I would hope that the organizers can share those links to the network, or to the people participating today. In the Gender Just Climate Solutions, you're going to see different types of technologies that move beyond that narrative. Technologies that, for example, there has been technologies in India for capturing water when the monsoon comes, and then storing it for the dry seasons. Technologies also for different energy solutions made out of briquettes from agricultural waste, and like making, because it's also about how we understand technologies. Technologies understood, of course, as the design or the implementation of these big hard words, but also technologies understood as ancestral knowledge, practices, techniques, put it into practice, and how we can come into a mix of both things, right? Or how can we respond to that? How we can, yes, yes, move into the renewable technology. When we talk about a just transition, no, we're talking about a lot about renewables and so on, but how we need to understand and to have a deeper understanding on, it's not about moving from one system to another. It might be not in all territories that we can put into practice those, for example, big windmills everywhere. No, we have seen, particularly in the case of Colombia, how indigenous communities have to fight back windmill projects because they have been appropriating and have been putting in place in indigenous and ancestral territory. So it is always a conversation, no, like a more holistic analysis and understanding of the context, of the needs, of the priorities, of the resources, no, like putting that feminist analysis. But definitely we need, no, like a more women in all the diversity, non-binary people being, no, part of leading those technologies, putting also the different needs and priorities of women in all the diversity throughout the different process of development.
Thank you, Gina. So the first question was on when we talk about changing and transforming the economic system, where do we start? Where do we start when we're thinking about changing the bigger picture? Then the second question was around feminist foreign policies and whether we think those have potential for more transformative change or where there might be some risks in adopting those types of policies. Davile, did you want to comment on any of those questions?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I think when we're looking at the bigger picture, it's important that we have research that go deep into finding out what women want, and especially women at local level and grassroots level, because that's where the impacts are taking place, and they have no input in all the development, all the transition, all the policies that are taking place. For an example, women are using energy most. Women's food security is in the hands of women. However, they don't contribute their input, they are not recognized or acknowledged. So it's important to find out what is working for women at the grassroots level. For an example, the cooking stoves. What type of cooking stoves do women want or need? Because a lot of women and young girls are affected by indoor pollution, resulting from the type of stoves or the type of energy that is being used. So looking at the bigger picture, it's important to do consultation on women and also to collect data and information that is related to climate change and the impacts at local level. Now looking at transformative policies. You know, we need action from these policies because, for an example, most policies in Africa, or let me say in South Africa, we have brilliant policies that talk about gender equality. However, there is no implementation that is taking place. We know a lot of funding is going towards mitigation. We need to have the balance of funding between mitigation and adaptation, and also a means of implementation. There's a lack of resources and finances to fund all that has to be implemented at local level and bring the changes that are needed there. So policies, gender responsive policies, and also gender budgeting in the finances is key, where we can be able to see progress in implementation and also addressing the needs at local level. Thank you.
Thank you. And Chandu, did you want to comment on feminist foreign policy?
Yeah, no, I think definitely, I think it's a tricky one where it can just become words and not necessarily action. So I'd echo what Ndube said around seeing these policies rooted in implementation and action as well. I think another reflection would be for seeing that justice angle being brought out through the feminist foreign development policy work, and actually seeing how the connections between climate justice, gender equality, racial justice can be woven through and are all intersecting issues. So seeing that how can that be presented within the policies, and then how can that be implemented through action? So I'd say, yeah, bringing out all of those justice angle, rights-based issues through the development policy work can be an additional way to actually see implementation on it happen.
Thank you. Any more questions? Another round, please.
I'm not sure how to articulate it. I'm Tracy Wargold, I'm from Site Savers. I'm really interested in the localization agenda in relation to gender and climate, because, you know, we talk about policies, and there might be beautiful policies in place at a national level, and then how do they filter down? And obviously we understand the value and the conceptual value of the localization agenda. But in terms of the reality on the ground, where we know the gender inequality at local levels is more entrenched, how do we progress this without just using the rhetoric and not actually achieving action?
Thank you. Another. Yes, Steve?
I also don't have quite two things. And it's probably if you have, and I was thinking actually on Gina, if you had like an example or a best practice from any of the contexts that you had worked with, in which you managed to see change to actually targeting attitudes, behaviors, and practices that are rooted on negative gender norms that are the root cause of why we're not seeing changes related to, you see, to the environment and to climate, you know, like, because we may have, as we said, the policies, the thing, and then it's all these norms that are rooted at different levels in that colonial system that works in different ways in that patriarchal system. So if those don't change or shift, we can have all the paper that we want written with all integration, but then change actually doesn't happen. So if you had like any sort of good practice of example of how those changes happen that go beyond us thinking that we can change things through training. If you see what I'm saying, because we tend to get a lot into it, and I don't think that that's the answer yet.
Thank you. One more, if anyone has at the back.
Hi, I'm Louise from MSI with Productive Choices. So it was sort of touched on a little bit, there was mention of SRHR, but I was interested really to hear from all the speakers about the impact of climate change on access to sexual and reproductive healthcare and rights, and particularly in the context of the rollback that we're seeing. And it, you know, even it can be, if anything, it could be more needs for those services, where if there's displacement, or if there's violence, or if there's even things like food and water insecurity might mean that women or girls are then having to go further to get food and water, and then be at more risk of sexual assault and things like that. And often that aspect of providing healthcare services is really overlooked. And 14 million women and girls are at risk of losing access to sexual reproductive health services as a result of climate change and the impact of it. So I'm just really interested to know how, if that has come up in your work, and what your thoughts on that are.
Thank you. So 3 questions. So the first one is around the localization agenda and how can we progress that in a meaningful way. Then one for Gina, or for anyone else who would like to comment, where have you seen change, particularly on gender norms happening? And then a question around the links between climate change and access to SRHR and to reproductive rights. So Gina, would you like to go first in maybe answering the gender norms question, and anything you wanted to comment on?
Yeah, I could come to that question. One very specific example and best practice that is, it might sound simple, but it has made a big shift. It's one of the organizations, of the awarded organizations from the Gender Just Climate Solutions. Enda Graf Sahel from Senegal, and you can also find more into detail into the experience of them in the publication Transformative Pathways that I share at the end. It's a context in Senegal. Senegal livelihood or diet is based on fish mainly, and particularly in very specific fish. And there are different, like working care relationships in the way of who is taking the fish, catching the fish, who is at home, and these like different dynamics. Due to big industries of fisheries that were now fishing like more far away from the coastal area, men that used to fish that fish in that area had to move to the coastal area, to the mangroves, and displace the women that were actually fishing this particular type of fish here. This fish that the women were catching, I don't know the word now in English, the women were not part of any type of committee. They did not have any type of participation or representation within those decision-making spaces of participatory spaces. Also because there is the normalization of our undervalued, unpaid care at home, within the household. So what Enda Graf Sahel did in collective with other women was to start doing some training, awareness raising campaigns, like with the fishermen, fisherwomen all together. They conducted a particular training, and the training was to understand the issue around time poverty. Time poverty that limits women's participation into these spaces. Time poverty also understood as how women have been taking the burden of the different activities within the household, but also outside. And they did a training, a session with both men and women, in which they described in different focus groups their daily routine. What do you do from this time to the other time? So women start saying, I wake up at 4 a.m., I start preparing the breakfast, I start getting my kids ready, then I go and walk to fetch water, then I do the agricultural thing, then I come to here, like all the story behind that. And the men at the same time, I wake up at this time, like around 8, 7 later, then I go to work, then I go maybe to lunch with a friend, then I end up at this time, then I meet somebody maybe after work, and then I come back home, and then I sleep at that time and the time. This training that was, like to understand the dynamic, made a shift in the participants, made a shift in the behavior, in the understanding of time poverty, in understanding care, in understanding that these undervalue layers of work that have not enabled women to participate into these spaces. And through these different type of trainings, because that of course it corresponds to a process, it's not just a one single training, but a process that went throughout time and space. Women have now been able to be part and also be leading different of the fishers committees in Senegal, making a partnership and cooperation around like the Saloum Delta, like the coastal part of Senegal, to then come into the conversation that meets the priorities of women fishers in this space. What are the differences? What are the different struggles? And also understanding that the mangroves cannot be cutted for wood because it represents different type of challenges or impacts in economic, ecological, and social changes. So it is just, I want to bring just a very concrete example, but how it can shift really behaviors when we start understanding deeper the why, and tackling it within the community and looking that into a policy making space. Yeah.
Thank you, Gina. Jidele, did you want to come back on any of those questions?
Yes, talking about localizing the gender policies and making them effective at local level. I think the key thing there, Gina has touched a lot on that. It is the care work. which has to be reflected in the policies. Because women miss out a lot because of care work. They miss out on education, on information, and you know, information like early warning systems. They miss out on attending meetings where they can be able to contribute meaningfully on what are their desires, what are their wants and needs when it comes to energy, water, and food security issues. I think in South Africa, we also had this assessment similar to what Gina alluded to, where we have both men and women in the same workshop, in the same training, and trying to find out the different uses of energy or of water from men and women. And the results were amazing. And that helped with a change of mindset from the men folks to understand why we say we need gender equality. We need women to give more input to participate in decision-making policies. And also, I think direct access to funding and resources is important, because currently how the funding works, it doesn't go directly to where it's needed, to the communities where it's needed. And if we can be able to achieve that, there will be a lot of difference at local women, and women will be able to be trained and empowered, and building capacity for women at local level will help with direct access to funding. And just to touch a little bit on the...
Thank you.
Oh, okay. Hello?
Oh, just finish up very quickly. We're just going to move on to the next section soon. But...
Okay. No, I was just saying that, you know, during the disasters, that's where you see a lot of sexual violence and gender-based violence, because in most instances, there is no proper plan. Governments, they don't have preventative measures in place. Instead, they just react, they respond to disasters, where you find that women and men, boys and girls, are put in one makeshift camp where women and girls will be subjected to sexual harassment, sexual violence. Yeah, I'll just stop there because there is no time, but yeah, there is a linkages of that to climate change issues. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm sorry to cut you off. There's so much to say. Candy, did you want to quickly comment on any?
Yeah, very briefly on the SRHR points and the linkages. I think that's where it's important, where I was talking about advocating for this cross-cutting and intersectional approaches. For example, in the education and climate change work, is comprehensive sexuality education being embedded within that? Are they recognizing the importance of that within the climate crisis context? Like Leah just said, the impacts when the crisis happens on women and girls, especially in access to services, dealing with violence. How is climate change education supporting that and being a part of that as well? And I think just generally talking about these as interconnected issues rather than separate issues is really important.
Thank you. So hand back to Yanina. Thank you.
Yeah, just okay. Time to wrap up. Yeah, just a massive thank you to Frankie and Chanju for being here, obviously to Gina and Davila for being online and taking the time to share your expertise with us. I think it was extremely valuable for all of us. And I hope the setup was okay for you, that you couldn't see everyone at all times as well. So yeah, thank you for leading us through this discussion. For the next part, I'm gonna say bye to the people online and to Gina and Davila. Thank you again. And hand over to Sophie for our little members rundown. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. So we'll move on to the next of the meeting. So I think many of you will be quite familiar, if you've been to a GADN members meeting before, of the members roundup session that we have, which Jessica, our director, very lovingly calls speed dating.